Where did the name Sarday, what was inspired by the name? Was it The Weeknd?
No, no, it wasn't. I was not actually looking for a theme song. We had a different name that we're incorporated under, and for some reasons I won't go into, realized we needed to change that name shortly before launch. And it was, kind of making sure that this name worked for trademark and as a consumer brand. But it's really around like, great, we're building a constellation of brands. Our partners are our star partners. There was just like it had some depth to it that led us to kind of like, oh, that's a great name that can encompass a whole lot of different brands and products underneath it.
Hey, I'm your host, Mike Gelb, and this is the Consumer VC podcast, where we discuss the intersection of venture capital and consumer innovation. If you're enjoying the show, also subscribe to the newsletter at theconsumervc.com, where you're going to receive all new episodes straight to your inbox and a weekly recap of all the consumer deals that are happening. All content and episodes are for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not investment advice. This episode is brought to you by Vauban from Carta. Vauban from Carta is the easiest way to launch and run your venture investing. They offer SPVs and fund vehicles for GPs at all stages of the journey, from your first syndicate to operating a multi-million-dollar venture fund. If you're interested in investing in startups, stick around after the episode where I chat with Gabriel Shin from the Vauban from Carta team, who shares his perspective and tips about how to start investing and how Vauban from Carta can get you set up. The link to Vauban from Carta's website is in the show notes. Our guest today is Chaz Flexman, who is the founder and CEO of Sarday. Sarday is a next-generation food conglomerate that uses data science to predict product market fit and create new brands. We discuss why he left Pattern Brands to go into food, how they create and launch new products very cheaply, how they think about data and trends and different categories to enter, and also how to build relationships with retailers. Without further ado, here's Chaz. Chaz, thank you so much for joining me here today on the show. How are you?
Doing well. Appreciate you having me on.
Thanks for your time. So you left Pattern Brands, which was an aggregator holding company focused on brands for the home. I know you come from a software tech background. Why CPG? Why food?
Yeah, so I originally kind of got into the hybrid of software and hardware when I ran a company called Wink, which is a smart home platform, kind of Alexa, pre-Alexa, but we made a couple of our own products and definitely fell in love with like the haptic feedback loop of like seeing a product you made in someone else's hands. It just like it's really kind of powerful, incredible feedback loop, which I really enjoyed, but also love how the combination of software really brings an element of data and thought and kind of complexity to it that I've always really enjoyed. And so I've kind of straddled, between the two for a lot of my career. Truthfully, after I left Pattern, I joined up with the folks over at Equal Ventures. They're a seed stage fund out of New York. And they're a very thesis-driven fund. And we're writing this kind of memo around, the future of F&B and retail. And it's like, sure, let me like scrub in and help you. I kind of joined as a venture partner and not sure if I wanted to go back into venture full time, but I'm just happy to help kind of build out this thesis. And about a month or two into it, I was like, oh, I don't want to invest in this. Like, I want to go build it. Like, no one's going to walk in the door with a better background than me. And this feels like kind of a summation of everything that I've done in my career to date. And so started incubating it with them over the course of 2020 and then off the races. I think why food, there's a couple of things. Like one, it's really trend and data driven, like attribute driven. So you can use data to really like drive a lot of your decision making. And that wasn't something that was like prevalent today, meaning, while it wasn't a consensus thing or a consensus approach, it was one I thought there was, a lot of opportunity to kind of create change and more predictable outcomes. And two, again, is just that haptic feedback loop. I mean, one of my favorite moments from this company has been when a friend of mine in Nashville went to a kind of have wine and drinks at a friend's house, and they were serving gooey. Just so happened, it's like, oh, it's my buddy's brand, and sent me a photo of it. And just seeing that and hearing from consumers and how much they love the product is just second to none.
Can you talk a little bit more about when you were at Equal, what that original thesis was?
Truthfully, it's pretty spot on to what we've built to date. You can build the next great F&B conglomerate using data at the core of how you understand pent up consumer demand and bringing brands to market that are going to work and predicting product market fit. I'd say the only thing that we've kind of realized more and more over time is that we're a B2B2C company. So we partner with big retailers to help make sure that we're solving their assortment risk with our products, but also giving them category lifts. meaning like similar velocity, if not higher, at what's on shelf, and like at a slightly higher price point that consumers are willing to pay for. I fundamentally believe that you build your brand online, you build your business in retail, and that's only kind of doubled down on that philosophy as we've kind of gone along.
I really appreciate that. I know that part of also the reason why you started Sarday as well was due to some of like the principles and methodologies that you saw happening in vertical SaaS and kind of applying it to food. Can you give like a breakdown of like what that means in this kind of third generation, is as you put it, of vertical SaaS?
One of our investors is Fidji, the CEO of Instacart. And we were having this conversation at some point. And she's like, Chaz, I used to run advertising at Facebook, and coming to F&B, I thought everyone's going to be doing what you're doing. It's like, yeah, it's not rocket science. It's just taking all the stuff we know from consumer software and applying it to F&B. And truthfully, for us, we think about like the product is the process, the output's just the brand. The data models that we built, are kind of the core intrinsic value, and the brands are what comes out of it. And so an analogy I like to give is Ford with the Model T. The Model T, like they invented the assembly line. The output was the Model T that was, more reliable, better priced, more, a better car. But the true innovation was actually on the assembly line side. And so we think about it from the same way. The core underlying data model lets us create a more predictable sort of outcome and predict product market fit. And that's where it is. That being said, I always get the question like, well, why don't you sell your software? And truthfully, F&B is littered with companies that are trying to sell data into F&B. And the reason for that is it's a very barbelled industry. You've got like the Nestle's of the world that, while they might spend $100 million on Nielsen, don't like really use data at all in terms of their decision making around what products to build or how to run their business. And then you've got like a bunch of smaller brands that, yes, they might pay for spins just to see how their products, are selling, but, don't have the balance sheets to actually really pay for software. There's no like real strong SME market, which means, if I know a brand can do $50 million or $100 million or $200 million, like why would I want to sell that data to someone else instead of like use it ourselves to then go build those brands and capture the value?
No, that makes sense in terms of why you would actually want to build those brands yourself, as opposed to just being a part of maybe like someone else's stack per se, as they're building out their own brands. Can you walk me through a little bit about how you are leveraging data science, as you say, to like de-risk a product market fit or to find product market fit, and figure out which types of products you actually want to launch?
Of course. If it look at like what's been historically done with like spins or Nielsen or IRI, they basically just kind of tell you basket share or like what's happened in the past of like nut butters, jellies, and jams. We start with a core consumer need and build around that. So it's like that's something like anti-inflammation or gut health or top 9 allergen free or sustainability. And we create these ontologies around them, which is kind of the umbrella under which the data lives. We use third-party data, APIs. We do web scraping. We've got some proprietary data partnerships. We kind of suck that in and then use like NLP on top of TikTok or Instagram because consumers aren't talking about products or their consumer need like they are nut butters, jellies, and spread. And so you've got to use a bunch of NLP to understand kind of what they're saying and how that's related. We run a bunch of models to kind of say like, great, what are the core attributes or product categories that are then associated with this core consumer need, and let that, really kind of dictate where those opportunities lie. A great example of that is low FODMAP. Our third brand, Kazumi, is a low FODMAP rice blend. There's more demand online for low FODMAP than there is for collagen. It's the number one prescribed diet to fight IBS and bloating, particularly within women. And yet there's only like a couple brands that are on the market servicing it today. And so we can use that data to really make sure that we're finding like pent up consumer demand. We then create a PRD just like you would in software and, work with our R&D firm to go spin up a couple thousand samples and do blinded consumer testing through a third-party service to test for taste and texture and all those kind of key attributes, because this is a repeat purchase at the end of the day, and consumers have to love it. And so it's not, it's not just like 10 of my friends being like, Chaz, this tastes great. Lastly, if you think about walking down the aisles of a Target or a Kroger and you see a box of Triscuits that's sitting on a shelf, to us, it's just an adding of that sitting on a shelf and adding it with kind of only 5 main variables of diet, health, ingredient, cuisine, and then brand. So we can start running a multivariate test just like you would in consumer software to figure out like, great, if I call something dairy-free versus vegan, how does that change pent-up consumer demand? Or, there's a set of attributes you might have to have, like non-GMO and gluten-free. There's ones, we call them the MVAs, the most valuable attributes that give you the right to win. So think Halo Top with 250 calories per pint. Had they been like the low sodium brand, probably wouldn't have worked. But we can test into a lot of that, that consumer demand and understanding everything from flavors to the color of the box to like those attributes. For instance, you'll see on Kuzumi with low FODMAP, it's actually a secondary attribute, not the top MVA attribute. That's because we can actually look at where something is in its adoption curve and say like, great, this isn't ready for like the primetime attribute, but we're as gut health is more of that like hook to consumers, and kind of orient around that. But all this kind of like flies in the face of how most F&B brands are built, which is normally around that kind of founder narrative of I have allergens as a kid, so I'm gonna create like an allergen-free cookie brand, and that's like the qualitative insight that's gonna lead me to the promised land. Where I don't think my taste buds represent mass America. I don't think I've got any God-given insight. I'm actually the last person to try all of our products because I don't think like my taste buds matter. And so it's really making sure that data is at the core of driving like where and what we build and let consumers tell us.
So, so you kind of start. I mean, as you say, you kind of start with like what like the macro problem is that you're looking to solve, and then seeing like kind of evaluating what the pent up consumer demand, doing a bit of analysis in terms of what other brands are there, and if there's an opportunity to introduce a new one, if there is only a small number of brands that are serving that consumer.
Our models really like prioritize a couple things. It's one, like trend relevance. Is this going to be something that like continues to build over time, or is it just a blip? Popularity, and then kind of correlation to consumer intent.
How do you define in terms of like if something's going to be a trend versus just like a blip?
Yeah, and so we're running a bunch of like LLMs and regression models to see like, great, how do we think this should play out historically versus certain areas of time versus kind of in the future. We score what we call events, which are these different independent data points, and like give it a ranking and scoring system to like actually tell us like what's the highest probability of success versus something that's might be more of a slower burn.
That's helpful. I think also you're saying how you're how traditionally we've had a number of incredible founders on the show talk about this, how usually it's usually a pain point from them or maybe one of their friends or maybe a sibling or a child or or a family member that they're not able to kind of have this product in market, so then they decided to go build it and then maybe realize that wow, there's actually maybe a lot big obviously, I mean, obviously that's why they build it, but there's a much bigger audience here of consumers that are in the need that where you're kind of more looking on the outside externally, thinking like what is kind of like the common consumer or like mass America is kind of needing for.
Exactly. I also, I think, and there's all credit to those founders and anyone taking the risk to go build something. I think sometimes those end up being a little more like a random walk down Wall Street. Like some work, some don't. And we're trying to use data to make it like predictable success, right? That it's like rinse and repeat, that we can do this multiple times over with a consistent like ability to predict product market fit at the end of the day. Because again, like I don't think my taste buds represent mass America, but I think consumers will tell you what they want if you know how to listen.
Well, how also do you define as mass America? Because and especially a lot of like the opportunities are like or a lot of the companies that are coming on the show and also start days, like usually these are like premium, more expensive brands, and usually you're not, for maybe like the everyday American. Like, how do you actually think about in terms of just mass America in total and the overall TAM?
It's something that retailers struggle with, which is like, look, just because something is selling well in 60 doors of Gelson's, does that mean it's necessarily going to work in mass America? Like, maybe not. And so we kind of think about it as like building an archetype and persona and psychographics actually around those core, kind of the 12 retailers that really matter, that drive most of the velocity, and understanding like, great, what are the psychographics of that consumer? Are they working out for strength management and stress management, but not working out for weight management, which might mean that like in a certain retailer, products that are in diet culture aren't actually going to work. And so there's, something like keto might actually not be a fit. And so if you actually focus on like those kind of core retailers that matter, you can develop psychographics around it and who those audiences are, across mass America. And so, yeah, it's also one of those things that like, if you can sell something for, $20 in Erewhon, that's wonderful, but that doesn't necessarily mean an Indianapolis mom of two is going to buy it. And that's where you get to real mass and scale. And so we do a bunch of testing on price points where we, run a bunch of traffic to our site. We'll A/B test different price points and see like where those conversion percentages change. To say like, great, that's your market clearing price of what consumers are willing to pay. We also spin up fake brands all the time to try and test them with that core kind of mass market audience versus, again, just saying like, hey, this is what's worked on the coast, because that doesn't necessarily translate to middle America.
Does this at all when you think about launching new brands and thinking about if it's right for mass America, I mean, as you said, just because it maybe works, a product works in 20 Gelston stores doesn't mean it's going to work in Kroger. Does that mean that when you think about that you actually have a preference in terms of which distribution channel you actually want to start in?
We think about starting with big box kind of from day one. Our first brand GUI rolled out in every Kroger in America. It's going into Target and Hy-Vee, and yes, we're getting into natural on the East Coast just because that's got a really strong presence there. But it's not saying we're starting with that local, then regional, then specialty, and hopefully you're going to get to big box. But big box is what ultimately drives scale, right? That's where people do most of their grocery shopping, and that's where you get real velocity and real revenue from. And that's core to where we want to be building for, is that kind of mass America.
How much does it cost your initial run to actually create a new product?
Yeah, I mean, we can basically build a brand in less than 6 months for less than $200K. And so we think of that like R&D costs as like our CAC. And so, if we're going and signing up a couple thousand doors, those initial load-in POs only pay back with gross margin, because we can get to a gross margin profile at scale, quite well. So we're not kind of slowly rolling out through different kind of stages of scaling up production. We're able to kind of go into mass production, kind of right away. That means we've got to do a lot more work on the front end on the R&D and development to making sure, our formulations work at scale. But also means we get to, revenue and margins, a great margin profile faster.
So do you do your own manufacturing?
No, we partner with various co-men and then a third-party R&D firm, but also have R&D in-house as well.
Now you have 4 brands, is that right?
Correct.
From doing those trials, did you say, once you maybe produce, you'll produce, once you maybe roll up a brand or start a brand, you'll introduce a brand and do market research maybe on 2,000 consumers and see if that's if this brand has legs. How many brands have you maybe started and you're like, actually, this is not going to work, or has it been none so far?
The testing that we do is actually on the product itself, right? To get taste and texture and those key attributes. But what we've actually found, I thought probably at the beginning we're going to have to kill a bunch of brands. We've actually found is because we have a stage gate model, just like you would in software, we end up iterating and going back. So Hebea is a great example of this, where we got it into consumers' hands and the scoring and feedback just wasn't strong enough. It wasn't bad, but just wasn't overwhelmingly positive. So we went back to the model and said, great, let's go stack some attributes on this to see if we can find more of a hook. And we found this chickpea protein because we found consumers wanted more protein in their diet, but wanted non-soy protein in their diet. So we found this chickpea extrusion to make that part of the crunch of Hebea, but now offering as 15 grams of protein that's not soy-based. And we ran it back through the testing again. It's now one of our highest scoring NPS products that we've made. And so it's more kind of iterative feedback loops where the cost of failure is a lot lower. There's also plenty of stuff that comes out of the data model that's just not feasible, right? Something might say adaptogen soups. And Lena, my co-founder, who's a 3-star Michelin chef, food scientist, she's created the first gluten-free flour brand. So you can look at something and be like, hey, adaptogen soups, for instance, adaptogens are really bitter. You're not gonna be able to cover that flavor. So that's not gonna work. So let's kind of throw it away. And so it's really kind of humans in the loop sort of thesis where, you've got to understand feasibility and viability, which go hand in hand.
Are there macro trends that you might, or rather a problem that maybe is very attractive in terms of there's a lot of interest in this problem within food that you actually don't think is really is really more on the fad side than a trend side?
I guess let me tweak your question a little bit. So we've done a lot around sustainability, and most of the brands that have come out are very much nail on head, alt meat. And consumers, while there is a core part of the population that definitely wants that, to activate mass consumers, that might not always be the fit for them. So it's how do you ingrain sustainability in ways that increases the actual audience size of consumers who are willing to pay for that? And so that could be things like GUI with palm oil free, right? That's ways to kind of introduce sustainability while still being a core mass market product. Or Hebea, being people want more protein in their diet. They want, plant-based offerings, but they don't want soy. And so it's an offering that gets people into the category and expands it versus just kind of nail on head of we need to be alt meat or alt protein.
Got it. So just kind of not as a direct kind of in your face of this is, a plant burger, for example, versus a normal burger per se.
Exactly. And so it's kind of activating that consumer through secondary routes, which we think can have more of an impact because you're getting people, to actually make sustainability part of their, their spend without it just being oh, I just want a plant-based burger. kind of nail on head, like I said.
I mean, you categorize as well, Sarday, from the get go as kind of more like a B2B2C type business where you're selling to the retailers, and then of course the consumers are buying the brands, which totally get. Like, are you also doing like, how are you also thinking about like pull marketing like initiatives to actually drive consumer demands for your product that actually then they actually go buy?
Yeah. So I think that, at the core of the data model, we're getting to like the why behind the consumer purchase. And if you're understanding the why, that means you can, like, if you think about kind of the brand architecture, that's kind of like the core of the brand architecture that you're building around. But it also means we can run that same NLP on TikTok to say, like, great, who are influencers that are talking about these products in the same way that we know is going to resonate with audiences? Or on the shelf danglers or out of home that we're running, knowing the core hooks of like why consumers are buying for GUI, like low sugar, is kind of the core hook there. And so if you get to that why behind the brand, it lets you kind of activate the marketing side and be much more kind of pointed with it. And to take advantage of tools, whether that's Instacart's, kind of ad platform, because the related search terms, or the messaging that you need to have on your landing page of aisle to drive BOGOs and driving people in store to trial the product, and it's really kind of using that why and those hooks throughout kind of all the different marketing tactics that we do.
Usually, kind of like the story for consumer brands is not always, but you kind of start online. You get demand, and then you kind of go omni-channel after you have a certain amount of sales online. And it seems like in this scenario, you're actually kind of starting per se in retail. Is that roughly correct or no?
We kind of do it concurrently, so we can show retailers a product that's like ready to go even before it's launched. You've got to remember, retail is focused on like line review cycles, so like they might not be opening up a category for 6-10 months until you can go pitch in. They select who it is and they close it for the next 12 months. And so it kind of depends on the line review cycle, and then when we have a brand that's ready. I think we use D2C largely just for data capture around a bunch of the testing that we're running. We think about Amazon or like a Thrive Market as, kind of a brand awareness and kind of building that halo effect. And then, getting into big box as fast as possible. But, our first brand we signed before it was even live with Kroger. So, we've definitely seen retailers that lean in at times and are willing to say like, great, we believe and understand the data model and we want to, participate.
Got it. And so it's using those channels to convince retailers that, hey, like this is first of all a trend, and secondly why we are the brand that's actually solving this problem.
Yep, exactly.
That's awesome. I remember reading like an article and you saying how you wanted to build that you're building maybe more of like the Ford versus the Unilever. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, again, it's that kind of the analogy I gave around the assembly line and the Model T. Right. It's like the tech is their underlying data models that we're building. The output's just the brand. And so it's really kind of starting. It's not just like saying we're going to be a house of brands. Like we want to build the next Nestle. We want to build the next great F&B conglomerate, but we want to use with data at the core that's driving the decisions to give consumers what they love.
We talked a bit about how emerging brands usually start, right? It's usually maybe their own pain point, usually, or like a family member or someone they knew a pain point. How do you think about innovation from like the corporate level, and what are they doing wrong in your mind?
Yeah. So one of my board members, Rick, jokes that he was the problem. He's a former consultant. And so Big Food is for the longest time been supply chain driven, right? They've had consultants that's like have told them to go put $100 in your CapEx to get 10% better throughput of your core ingredients. Go do multi-year derivative deals on those ingredients to lock in the prices for years. And that's why like most of the things that they launch are supply chain driven, not consumer driven. Like no consumer's asking for Jimmy Dean sausages to make blueberry flavored Jimmy Dean sausages, or Campbell's to launch soup sauces, right? And but if you're Jimmy Dean sausages and consumers now want alt meat and gluten free, it's like, what are you going to do? You put $100 million in your capex, and now you're kind of stuck with that. You kind of kick the can down the road to the next person. Similarly, like they're very much stuck in that intuition age. If anyone's seen the movie Moneyball with Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill, it's kind of like when Jonah Hill walked in and there was a group of scouts and they're talking about, player recruitment. Like, oh, that's a 5-tool player. I know a great swing when I see it. He's like, no. We need like on-base percentages, because if you get on base, you score runs, and let's use data to drive those decisions on who we bring, under our roster. That same sort of thing is here, where we think that like instead of being driven by the supply chain, you can use data, and that's just something that Big Food fundamentally doesn't know how to do. at the core, they don't have a CDP. They don't understand who their core consumers are. They're not using data in their products. It's largely just saying like, great, let's add blueberry flavoring because we can push through more of our core products onto retail shelves and call it innovation.
When I also think about leveraging data, especially in CPG or just maybe consumer brands more generally, at least from investment side, I think about Circle Up and what they did when it comes to looking at data and kind of reading what are they going to be the next kind of breakout brands. Did you happen to have any learnings in like observing like their story?
Sure. So Ryan Kalbeck's a personal investor and a friend, and someone I think is one of the smartest folks in the space. He would say, if you think about a horse race, they needed to like both, pick the jockey, pick the horse, and like, who's going to win place in show, and making sure that they're getting into the right entry price to get at the right exit price, and that this thing was going to work. We more need to know like we've got the horse with the right attributes that it's going to perform well in the race and be top three. I mean, that, there's like a power in niches where like, some of this might be a $50 million brand. It might be a $150 million brand. If I could predict the invisible asymptote for any of these things, I'd go buy a lottery ticket because that's like, that's nearly impossible. And so I think we learned a lot about like, hey, you need to understand those things like most valuable attributes or like the characteristics that are driving, consumers to buy. It's also why, they've obviously used, I forget if it's called Halo or what it is, that they sell as like a B2B software. And one of the things we saw is like, look, this industry is very barbelled, right? Where you got a lot of small brands that don't have balance sheets to really pay for data other than maybe spins to seeing how their products work. And again, you've got the big Nestle's of the world that yes, spend a ton of money on Nielsen, but don't like use data, and it's not kind of, part of their what they're buying. But there's no like SME kind of market here. And so that's where, a lot of database companies kind of go to die. It's like, well, why would I sell our software for $10K to someone when I can capture more value by actually building the brand ourselves and starting that way? And so I think it's understanding like, we're not selling our software to someone else. We're consuming it ourselves and capturing value that way.
Got it. So just so I guess like part of the learning from Circle Up was let's use all this data and kind of leverage it for ourselves for building new brands. As you said, not to actually sell this as like an additional service for others. How do you also thinking about building new brands? How do you think about focus? How do you think about how many brands to actually launch and maybe what like the overall calendar year looks like?
Sure. I mean, we've done 4 brands in the last basically 18 to 20 months, which I think when I was raising Original Seed, people were like, oh, you can't build multiple brands. Well, I think there's always the question of like how many SKUs do you need to go and how broad does any one brand need to go? And like, especially at the different inflection points. So like, we don't really think about adding additional SKUs until the brand's been on retail shelves for at least 6 months, just because that's when we have enough signal to figure out like, where should we expand that into? I think as we start to partner with retailers more, we're like, hey, we can use our data to say like, great, this is all the places that you should be building. Like you should have brands, and we can show you in the data, like this is holes in your portfolio because, you A, don't use data well, and B, you're, overrun with smaller brands that are pitching you that you don't know if they're going to fit. We can be that partner D where we go launch, a dozen brands in categories that matter. And so I think the more that we have our retail partners locked in and truly partnered on like saying like, great, like let's get out of category review cycle, but into let's build brands that service the needs of your consumer. And again, these are our brands, not their own like house brands. That will let us kind of build more and more because we've got that go-to-market kind of done or kind of locked in, if you will.
And then on top of that, since you would be building more and more brands, then that just increases your leverage because because obviously you're just feeding them more and more brands and kind of building more pipe.
Exactly. We don't have like a hard number of like how many we want to do a year. I think we'll probably do between 2 and 6 next year. We just launched 2 this year, and so it's figuring out what's the right cadence with our partners on the go-to-market side.
In your mind, how long do you believe take to build a beloved brand?
I think there's stages of it, right? There's like building consumer awareness. There's activating households, having them trial your product. It's why you run TPRs or BOGO campaigns. I'd say that, if you walk down the aisles of a Kroger or a Whole Foods or a number of other retailers, how many of those brands do you actually like know and love, right? Or have you ever been to their website? And the answer is not very many, right? There's always a couple, but like maybe it's Banza or Goodles or Magic Spoon. But there's not many like that you recognize that, that are owned by Kraft or Hershey's or Nestle. And so I think because they're like a lower AOV product, it's very different than at Pattern where it's like a higher AOV product. You've got to like build more brand awareness to convert, where it's a lot of it is making sure you've got the right things on shelf and consumer awareness of the product to get them hooked in buying. Because, once you get someone on your product, they're going to be with you for years, because you're giving them the product that they want.
Was that at all transitioning from Pattern to Serde, where obviously very, very different type of products, Pattern, much more durable products, is shifting towards consumables. Just when you think about the overly operating, obviously very, very different businesses, but just for you personally, was that kind of a big shift for you?
Yeah, it was one of the ways I because we can build brands that are so to market and so quickly, and because it's so attribute driven, is where these data models actually like, oh, this works a whole lot better than, if it takes you 18 months to build a CPG brand and they're very much design driven. So you can't get a lot of, data, back into your development cycles. That doesn't mean it's none. There's plenty of learnings from Pattern there, but you can influence it a whole lot more because the shorter production cycles. And then again, on the, knowing that retailers are, what really drive volume, and that getting placement on shelf and optimizing that ad unit of your packaging on shelf is incredibly important, because it's a lower AOV kind of snap decision when a person's walking down an aisle.
What were some of the challenges when you did fundraise, or how did that process go? Because as you kind of pointed out earlier, I think investors kind of want you building one product. They want you to focus on building one product. I think partially the reason is because the majority of the great exits happen happen through strategics, and strategics usually only acquire one brand. Of course, this is a very different scenario because you're building a holding company. Just how was that whole process for you?
I mean, no matter how many times I've done fundraising, it's never fun. And given me,
There's no fun in fundraising.
No. Look, like what we're building today isn't consensus, right? And I think that's what venture's for. Like saying we're using data to build brands is not a consensus statement. I think if you fast forward 5 years, it's going to be consensus. Like it becomes like of course, why would you build it any other way? And two, like, it's like we're building the next Nestle, but we're also like a data science company. You've got to like kind of really scrub in. But it also means we can create more equity efficiency, which is what venture is meant for, by getting to a level of scale faster, to a gross margin profile faster, where it makes venture money make sense. And so I think it's one of those, we've got a great set of investors that have been believers from day one. I think it's always an education process with new investors where they can't just look at us as a software company. They can't just look at a CPG company, and to really kind of doing the work to understand, like, great. One of the things my time at Andreessen taught me is there's two ways of looking at venture. One is like, why won't this work? Or if this does work, how big does it become? And like, if we do this right, we're an N of one outcome in F&B. We're a multi-billion-dollar company versus just selling a brand for $100 million or $150 million, which is kind of more traditional, that single product line. And just making sure that people understand, like, great, if we continue to be right and continue to build, like we're building an N of one outcome, and that like fits the power law curve of venture capital.
You're developing a new brand. How do you think overall about like that story of the brand? Since it's not, as you say, like the traditional way, which it's usually very personal. It's usually an entrepreneur that kind of has, maybe a family member, maybe it's them, maybe it's someone that has that they know that maybe is struggling with this particular problem and they want to solve it. How do you think overall about story in your brands when you're creating one, since it is, very tech heavy?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think we're trying to get there in the same way that narrative as well, which is the why behind the brand, right? And what's that underlying core consumer need that's not being met today? And making sure that the brand that we build, we have a wonderful partner on the brand side, Camille Baldwin, who runs, it's called Outdoor Cats, but who's the former head of brand at Gin Lane and the head of brand at Pattern and part of the founding team as well. Where it's like, look, we're giving her a ton of insight to then go build that brand architecture and voice and visual and copy, around, to make sure it's a why that's resonating with consumers and that we can go build around, and really kind of hammering home on that. And so it's, again, I think it's two ways to kind of get to the same like ultimate conclusion, which is that like why a consumer should care.
What's one book that's inspired you personally and one book that's inspired you professionally?
Personally, Richard Branson's How I Lost My Virginity, the story of Virgin. Is one of those, I read it in one sitting and kind of realized I needed to get on the front foot of life and like go after the things that I wanted, and not just hope that it's, how the cards are going to unfold. And so that was like one of those moments. Like that's where it gave me the courage and the fortitude to go break into venture capital back in 2011, and really kind of going after like, great, this is what I want the next step in my career to be. I'd say the two business books that have really like influenced me a lot recently are the Everything Store, which is the story of Amazon, and then the book on Disney. I'm going to blank on the name of it now. Ride of a Lifetime, which is just like an incredible story about leadership and how that kind of happened over time.
That's great. We had a few guests mention these three, so excited to add your name to them. This is awesome. A final question: where did the name Starday? What was inspired by the name? Was it The Weeknd?
No, it wasn't. I was not actually looking for a theme song. We had a different name that we're incorporated under, and for some reasons I won't go into, realized we needed to change that name shortly before launch. And it was, kind of making sure that, this name worked for trademark and as a consumer brand. But it's really around like, great, we're building a constellation of brands. Our partners are our star partners. There was just like it had some depth to it that led us to kind of like, oh, that's a great name that can encompass a whole lot of different brands and products underneath it.
Chaz, really appreciate you taking the time.
Wonderful. Appreciate you having me on.
And there you have it. It was a pleasure chatting with Chaz. Chaz, thanks again for coming on the show. Gabriel, thank you for joining me today. How are you?
Yeah, really great. Thanks for having me, Mike.
No, it's a really, really appreciate it. So when someone wants to invest, whether they've started their own fund, they're an emerging manager, or they have LPs, or whether they're an angel investor, how do they typically get started? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, our platform makes it easy for people to pool funds together and invest in early stage startups. There's a number of reasons someone would use, SPVs or want to create a venture capital fund. So, for angels, I would say, the most important part is, diversifying your portfolio. So instead of, putting 10K checks into, a single company, you can diversify by putting your eggs in various different baskets using an SPV. So it's a predominantly popular use case to kind of diversify your angel investing. As you know, it's a highly risky asset class. So instead of being concentrated in one single asset, it allows you to invest in multiple. So that's a use case there.
Cool. So how does Vauban kind of make it easy, and what do you need to think about on like the admin side in order to actually set up, whether you're angel investing, whether they're setting up like an SPV, or a fund?
Yeah. So, fundraising is a pretty difficult task, whether you're a founder, angel, or, a venture capitalist. So with our product, we have all the ancillary services incorporated into the platform using a digital platform. So, we handle the legal documents to create a separate legal entity. We have a banking partner that is incorporated into the dashboard. We'll onboard the investors. You'll have real-time information of how your fundraising process is going. And then we'll handle any administrative aspects such as reporting, any taxes, and ultimately the distribution at an exit scenario. So, if a company goes IPO, if a company gets acquired, how does that capital flow back to the investors? So, we handle all of that. So our clients can focus on, finding great opportunities, networking, building relationships, and building those investor relationships, which takes a lot of time and effort, as anyone who's been fundraising will know.
If you are loving the show, I highly recommend checking out the newsletter at theconsumervc.com, where you'll receive all new episodes straight to your inbox and a weekly recap of all the consumer deals that are happening. I'm also doing some more events, so you'll also be the first one to receive information about those.